British tank with the largest gun in history from which it fell apart. On September 7, 1945, the tracks of tanks rumbled through the streets of ruined Berlin, and the whole world froze in anticipation of what would happen next. The four victorious powers organized a joint parade in honor of the end of the bloodiest war in human history. And each of them brought to this demonstration of strength the best they had in their arsenals. The British rolled out their Comets and brand-new Centurions. The Americans demonstrated Shermans and Pershings. The French showed the little they had left after the occupation. But when the machines of the Soviet Union crawled onto the pavement, the jaws of Western military observers literally dropped, because something appeared before them that they did not even suspect. The IS-3 heavy tank looked as if it had arrived from the future. Its flattened turret with incredible armor slope angles seemed like something alien against the background of angular Western machines. The nose of the hull was made in the shape of a pike nose, which made the frontal projection practically invulnerable to any shell of that time. 120 millimeters of armor at an angle of 55 degrees gave the equivalent of almost 200 millimeters of protection, and the turret in the thickest places reached 240 millimeters. At the same time, the Soviet machine carried a gun with a caliber of 122 millimeters, capable of turning any Western tank into flaming scrap metal from a distance of 2 kilometers. British officers present at the parade immediately sent reports to London, and the content of these reports was extremely alarming. Their best tank, the Centurion, had only 180 millimeters of frontal armor, and its 77 millimeter gun, although considered excellent, looked unserious against such a monster as the IS-3. The Comet had only 100 millimeters of protection, which was less than that of the old Churchills of the war era. The military leadership of Great Britain realized a simple and frightening truth. If the Soviets decided to move west, there would be simply nothing to stop their tanks. But real horror gripped British strategists when they thought about the future. If the Soviet Union managed to create such a machine by the end of the war, then what would they build in 5 or 10 years? The Iron Curtain was descending over Europe, and on the other side of this curtain, Soviet designers were surely already working on something even more formidable. The Cold War was just beginning, and Great Britain found itself in the position of a country whose tank forces could at any moment become useless against the latest Soviet armored vehicles. Feverish meetings began at the War Office, discussing a single question: how to penetrate the armor of Soviet heavy tanks. Existing guns were not suitable for this, and developing new ones took years. The British needed something radical, something so powerful that no armor could withstand it. In August 1950, the military department issued a technical specification that made engineers clutch their heads. It was required to create a gun capable of penetrating 152 millimeters of armor located at an angle of 60 degrees at a distance of almost 2 kilometers. No such guns existed in the British arsenal, and calculations showed that to fulfill this task, something completely unprecedented would be required. The caliber of the future gun was to be 183 millimeters, which exceeded the caliber of the main gun of some naval ships. It was madness, but a forced madness, dictated by fear of Soviet armored power. Thus was born the idea of creating a machine that would go down in history as the most extreme response to the Soviet tank threat. A machine named FV4005, armed with the largest tank gun in the history of mankind. A gun of such power had never before been installed on a tank, and British engineers perfectly understood that colossal difficulties awaited them. But there was no choice, because the survival of Western civilization in a potential war with the Soviets was at stake. Engineers of the Royal Arsenal received a task that would make any sane designer's hair stand on end. They had to create a tank gun of such a caliber that the world had never seen, and at the same time somehow make it work on a mobile chassis. Calculations showed that to guarantee the destruction of promising Soviet heavy tanks, A gun with a caliber of at least 183 millimeters was necessary, firing special high-explosive shells with plastic explosives. The British called these munitions HESH, and the principle of their action was devilishly effective. Upon impact, the explosive flattened against the armor and then detonated, tearing off lethal fragments from the inside even without penetration. By December 1952, the gun had taken its final shape and the official designation L4. The actual caliber was 183 millimeters, and this gun broke all conceivable records for tank armament. The barrel length reached 7.3 meters, which exceeded the length of many city buses. The weight of the gun alone, without the turret and mechanisms, was 2.8 tons. And this created a completely new class of engineering problems that British designers had not encountered before. But the ammunition for the future machine became a real nightmare for the developers. A shell for the L4 gun weighed from 65 to 72 kilograms, depending on the modification, which was approximately equal to the weight of a washing machine or a strong adult man. The height of a fully assembled round approached 1.5 meters, and it was a two-component ammunition. First, the loader had to load the shell itself into the breech and then separately insert a brass casing with a powder charge weighing 31 kilograms. Obviously, it was simply impossible for one person to cope with such work. Now the question arose about the carrier for this monster. The military department considered 4 options for installing the gun on a combat vehicle. The first involved a full-fledged tank with a turret rotating 360 degrees and heavy armor. The second option was a self-propelled unit with a limited firing sector but powerful frontal protection. The third allowed for full or partial turret rotation with minimal armor. The fourth and most radical option suggested abandoning any armor altogether, turning the machine into a pure gun carrier. The choice fell on the second option, and in January 1951, the design of a machine based on the promising heavy tank FV4014 began, which would later receive the name Conqueror. This project was designated as FV215, and it was to become the main carrier of the giant gun. But a serious snag arose. The Conqueror itself was still under development, and designing a new machine on the basis of a non-existent chassis was a risky venture. The British military decided to create a temporary version to test the gun on an already existing chassis. They chose the Centurion of the third modification as a reliable and field-proven platform. This intermediate machine received the designation FV4005, and it was destined to become the carrier of the largest tank gun in history. Initially, it was assumed that the FV4005 would serve only as a test bed to work out all the problems before installing the gun on a full-fledged FV215. Designers understood that placing such a gun on a medium-class tank would require serious compromises. Due to the monstrous recoil, horizontal aiming was limited to 45 degrees in each direction from the longitudinal axis of the machine. The ammunition load had to be cut to 12 rounds on the machine with a closed turret, because more simply would not fit. The crew was to consist of 5 people: a commander, a gunner, a driver, and 2 loaders, because no strong man could lift 70-kilogram shells alone. Work on the FV4005 began in 2 directions at once. Engineers prepared 2 prototypes with fundamentally different approaches to crew protection and the loading mechanism. The first prototype of the FV4005 received the official name of a heavy anti-tank self-propelled unit and looked frightening even to its creators. It was a machine of the first stage of development, and British engineers deliberately abandoned any crew protection in favor of maximum simplification of the design. The L4 gun, with a caliber of 183 millimeters, stuck out from an open platform like a giant finger pointing to the sky, and the crew was in the open air without the slightest shelter from fragments or bullets. The barrel elevation angle was 15 degrees, and the gun could be lowered 7 degrees below the horizon. These modest parameters were explained not by design errors, but by the real danger posed by the recoil of this monster. Engineers seriously believed that when firing with a large turret rotation angle, the recoil energy could simply tip the 50-ton machine on its side. No one knew for sure what would happen when this gun first fired from a tank chassis, and the designers were preparing for the most unexpected consequences. On the first prototype of the FV4005, a unique loading facilitation system was installed, which had not been used on tanks before. It was a massive revolver drum holding 5 shells ready for firing, very similar in operating principle to the drum of a giant revolver. The mechanism was supposed to help the loader deal with the heavy ammunition, turning the next shell to the breech of the gun and facilitating its loading into the barrel. Theoretically, this looked like an elegant solution, but in practice, everything turned out to be much more complicated. The gun barrel was equipped with a concentric recoil system, which was a massive cylinder surrounding the lower part of the barrel. This system was supposed to absorb the monstrous recoil energy during firing and prevent the destruction of the structure. By April 1952, the first prototype of the FV4005 was fully assembled and ready for testing. But before rolling it out to the range, the British decided to play it safe. A special ground anchor was mounted on the rear of the machine, which was a massive steel wedge that was lowered and buried in the ground before firing. This anchor was supposed to hold the FV4005 in place during firing and not allow the multi-ton machine to roll back or tip over. This solution looked crude for combat equipment of the mid-20th century, but the engineers perfectly understood what forces they would have to deal with. Parallel work was underway on the second prototype of the FV4005, and this machine was to look more traditional. A closed turret was installed on the Centurion chassis, housing the entire crew of 4 people. However, the armor thickness of this turret was only 14 millimeters around the entire perimeter, and it could protect only from shell fragments and pistol bullets. There could be no talk of full-fledged armor, since any weight increase of the turret would lead to exceeding the permissible mass of 50 tons. On the second prototype of the FV4005, the revolver loading mechanism had to be abandoned. The enclosed space of the turret did not allow for such a bulky structure, and instead, 2 loaders were to work with the shells. The rate of fire of the machine was estimated at only 2 rounds per minute, which was insignificantly small by the standards of tank combat. The gun was equipped with a hydropneumatic recuperator and an independent mechanism for returning to the combat position, the design of which differed from the first prototype. A separate problem was the sighting equipment for the FV4005. British industry was to develop special sights for a machine with such an unusual gun. However, deadlines were constantly missed. As a result, the engineers made a decision that surprised many. The German TZF-12A sight, taken from a captured Panther tank, was installed on the FV4005. This was high-quality optics, proven in the battles of the Second World War. And although such a solution looked strange for a secret British project, it allowed the testing not to be delayed. By June 1953, the first prototype of the FV4005 was rolled out to the range for the first firings. Military men and engineers held their breath because no one could predict how the machine would behave when the most powerful tank gun in history first spewed fire. The first shot from the FV4005 gun made an indelible impression on the observers, and this impression was far from joyful. When the gunner pressed the trigger, the range shook from a deafening roar, and the 50-ton machine jerked as if it had received a blow from a giant hammer. Officers and engineers at a safe distance watched as the nose of the tank jumped 22 centimeters, while the rear sank 12 centimeters. And at an elevation angle of 3 degrees, the rocking reached 27 centimeters in front and 19 in the back. The machine literally reared up from the recoil of its own gun. Testers carefully recorded every parameter of the FV4005 behavior during firing, and the results were entered into official reports that would later become evidence of this insane experiment. When firing without using the ground anchor, the machine rolled back 23 centimeters, which created serious problems for re-aiming. With the anchor, the performance improved twofold, but still remained beyond what was considered acceptable for combat equipment. The real nightmare began when the FV4005 gun was turned 90 degrees and a shot was fired to the side. The official report, in dry, bureaucratic language, recorded that firing with such a turret rotation angle transmits oscillations of extremely high amplitude with rapid cyclicity to the hull. Translating into human language, this meant that the 50-ton tank shook like a baby rattle. The machine shifted to the side by 5 centimeters, and every node of the structure experienced loads for which it was simply not designed. At some point in the testing, it became obvious that the vertical aiming mechanism of the FV4005 had completely failed. Upon inspection, it turned out that the shock wave from the shots literally bent the internal components of the mechanism, and the mounting bolts were sheared off like with a knife. The gun that was supposed to destroy Soviet tanks was destroying its own machine with every shot fired. Engineers began to feverishly look for ways to strengthen the structure, but the problem was fundamental. The Centurion chassis was simply not intended for such loads. After a series of incidents, the testing commission issued a recommendation that made the military's blood run cold. In an official document, it was strongly recommended not to allow any crew member to be at combat positions inside the FV4005 turret during firing until the completion of a full cycle of instrumental tests. In other words, the machine was so dangerous for its own crew that people were forbidden to be in it when it performed its direct function. By July 1955, the second prototype of the FV4005 with a closed turret was ready, and it was immediately included in the testing program. This machine went through a real purgatory. During the tests, 133 shots were fired from its gun, each of which shook the structure and revealed more new weak spots. The thin 14mm turret armor rattled and vibrated with every shot, and the testers inside compared the sensation to being inside a giant bell being hit with a sledgehammer. Throughout the next year, testing of both FV4005 prototypes continued, with the goal of gaining experience for the main project, the FV215, based on the Conqueror. Every firing brought new data about the behavior of the ultra-powerful gun on a tank chassis, and this data was disappointing. Accuracy at the maximum range of 2 kilometers left much to be desired, especially in crosswinds, since the huge shell was blown off its trajectory more than the compact ammunition of conventional tank guns. British engineers worked stubbornly to eliminate the identified shortcomings, believing that sooner or later they would be able to tame this monster. But while they fought the laws of physics, the world around them was rapidly changing, and technological progress was preparing a stab in the back for the FV4005 from where no one expected it. A new weapon appeared on the horizon that threatened to make the entire concept of giant tank guns hopelessly obsolete, and the British military had to make a difficult decision about the fate of the project. While British engineers struggled to tame their 183mm monster, a completely different type of weapon was being born in laboratories across the Western world. Anti-tank guided missiles appeared like a bolt from the blue and instantly overturned all ideas about fighting armored vehicles. These small projectiles with a jet engine could be guided to the target in flight, correcting the trajectory via wires or a radio signal, and they guaranteed to hit a tank at distances unreachable for any barreled gun. The cost of one such missile was a negligible fraction of the costs for developing and producing the FV4005 with its colossal gun. At the same time, the missile could be installed on almost any carrier: a light armored car like the Ferret, a helicopter, a jeep, or even a portable tripod for use by infantry. One soldier with a missile system on his shoulder could destroy a heavy tank from a distance of several kilometers, and there was no protection against this. The British military department was faced with an unpleasant dilemma. Years of work and huge funds had been invested in creating the FV4005 and the promising FV215. But now this entire program looked like a costly anachronism. A gun with a caliber of 183 millimeters at a maximum distance of 2 kilometers did not differ in high accuracy, especially in conditions of crosswind, which blew the massive shell off the trajectory. A guided missile, on the contrary, hit exactly where the operator directed it, and it was much harder to miss with it. 1957 was a turning point for the British armed forces. The government announced a large-scale cut in military spending, and dozens of new weapons development programs went under the knife. Army regiments were merged and disbanded, orders for equipment were cut, and promising projects were closed one after another. In this atmosphere of austerity, the FV4005 and FV215 had not a single chance of survival. The verdict was passed quickly and without appeal. Both projects were closed with an immediate stop to all work. Officials calculated that anti-tank missiles provided the same combat effectiveness at a cost 10 times lower, and it was impossible to argue with this arithmetic. Why spend millions on a complex machine with a gun that destroys itself when a simple missile solves the same task cheaply and reliably? In addition, intelligence reported that the Soviet Union was gradually moving away from the concept of heavy tanks in favor of mass production of medium machines, and the threat for the sake of countering which the FV4005 was created began to dissolve by itself. The FV4005 prototypes suffered the sad fate of most experimental machines. They were disassembled, turrets removed from the chassis, and components sent for storage or recycling. One of the turrets of the second prototype was handed over to the Royal Military College of Science in Shrivenham for use in educational purposes, where it was to serve as a visual aid for future designers. It seemed that the history of the largest tank gun in the world ended ignominiously, and the FV4005 was destined to sink into oblivion as another dead-end branch of armored vehicle development. However, fate decreed otherwise. The FV4005 turret survived decades of oblivion, and in 1971 ended up in the collection of the Tank Museum in Bovington. There it stood in the open air, exposed to rain and winds, and children visiting the museum climbed on it to play, long before safety measures were seriously considered. In 2007, the turret was installed on a Centurion chassis of the 8th modification and displayed at the entrance to the museum as a kind of guardian. And then something unexpected happened. A computer game about tanks made the FV4005 a world celebrity. Millions of players around the world learned about the British machine with an absurdly huge gun, and it gained cult status among armored vehicle enthusiasts. In 2024, an enthusiast named Joe Hughes, with the support of the Tank Museum and the gaming community, took on the full restoration of the only surviving specimen. The turret was connected with an authentic Centurion chassis of the 3rd modification, and a restored engine and transmission were installed. And for the first time in almost 70 years, the FV4005 was able to move under its own power. If you like this story about Britain's craziest tank project, be sure to like this video and write in the comments what you think about the FV4005. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new stories about legendary military equipment, and press the bell to receive notifications about fresh releases.